Hey everyone, Sean Frangella here again with another Cinema 4D tutorial, and this one is all about workflow shortcuts and doing things faster in Cinema 4D, because I'm a big fan of using shortcuts, customizing menus, and doing things quicker so you can focus on what you're trying to do without thinking of where the menus are and having to go to copy paste and things like that. So we're going to talk about customizing these menus, customizing some other menus like these, shortcuts for textures, shortcuts for our little window over here, and kind of lots of little tips to get you working faster in Cinema 4D. That's some of the stuff we're going to go over, and we'll build some little test animations, and I'm just going to start a new file and kind of reset everything so I can get started. So my new file, I'll go to layouts and just put it back to standard to get rid of the stuff that I have. So this first point I want to make is these buttons up here. By default, you have your shapes and your splines, and you have to click and hold to get into those. And a nice customization option is if you right click and go to customize palettes, you can type in here and get shortcuts to things like these options, say like sphere, and drag it up here and just line those up. So what I like to do, if we look in our layout once I reset this, is kind of group them into these types of objects. So if I close this, we have my shapes, and again we have path, and I like to make a couple of these. So if I was doing this from scratch, I could grab my lathe, drag it up here, my loft, and kind of visually have those grouped together. And what's nice about this is you can separate it with things like this icon and group separator to kind of give yourself some visual space. I'll grab my customized workout again to kind of show that result. And in the descriptions of this video, I'll put my layout if you just want to save yourself some time and grab my custom layout that I really like to have for this. So that'll get us our icons, and that's a good shortcut for that stuff, because then again, if you're just doing basic stuff, you can grab this, copy paste it, drop something like the loft, and save a lot of time. But there's this other menu in the viewport that I really like to use, and it's if you press V, you can get some shortcuts like tools, modes. So if you had a cube and you press C to make it editable, you can quickly get edges, points, paths, and things like that, and then do your modeling. But if we take a look at mine, I've added some things, and I really like using this one to kind of do another step beyond going up here, as having everything that I would use quickly available by just pressing V and shooting over to these custom menus to just grab this stuff. So say if I have in my basics, which I named a cube, and I give it segments 222, and I want to grab a bend and drop it in here, I could do that a lot quicker with this menu and kind of populating it with everything that I like to use. And I know it's just the top of the screen, but you figure you do this hundreds and hundreds of times, this can really save a lot. So let's talk about setting that one up. There's a couple more steps, but it can really be nice to customize this. So for that, if we go to Window, Customization, Customize Commands, that gives us that list that we were using to populate this area. And then if we go to Window, Customize Menus, this allows us to customize everything in Cinema 4D pretty much. So if we click this drop down, it's defaulted to Editor. So we could even reorder this menu up here if you wanted File to be all the way on the right for some reason. The one that we want, if we look through this, is M Global Pop-Up, and this will give us what we see when we press V over here. So by default, it just has Tools and Modes, View, Snap, and Projects, which is one that I really like to use just default to quickly switch between projects that you might have open, like your next tutorial. But what you can do is click any of these and say I wanted to make one. So if I wanted all polygons down here, I can go to New Submenu, type polygons, and then just go over here, and again, same as up here, type things like cube, sphere, and drag with the left arrow and drop them in here. And then when I do apply, when I go over here, now we can see that it's added polygons here at the top because it's at the top. So what's cool about this is add all these menus kind of called whatever you want them to be, reorder them, and then based on from the top being the center ones, and then down the left, and then down the right. So what I've done is left these ones that are default ones down here and added ones for basics, for things that I use all the time, like nulls, cubes, sphere, cameras and lights. and then cut everything up into the couple splines that I use, like circles and end sides, spline mask, generators like extrude loft sweep, modeling things like connect and symmetry and bool, and then some deformers that I use. And just to make sure that when I restart Cinema 4D, these will be here and this will be here, what I want to do is make sure that I save this as a layout. And you can save it as your startup layout or save layout as, and it will save your layout where you want it, which defaults to this long path in the Cinema 4D file, and that's fine. And so you just click save. Then that will be in there when you go to customize layouts. So again, I'll drop mine in the comments. This is kind of what I like to use. So that's how we can customize our menus and get things moving quicker once we're making stuff. So let's talk about some shortcuts in the viewport and project setup, and then we'll get into shortcuts with textures and some other things. So with the basics in our viewport, option left mouse button to orbit, option right mouse button to zoom in, or if you have a trackpad or a scroll wheel or a magic mouse from Apple, you can just scroll in, and middle mouse button will pan, or if you're on a laptop or don't have a 3-button mouse and are stubborn like I am, you can press 1 and hold, and that will pan around. And then the couple of quick project things with getting set up is Command B will give us our project settings. So let's say this was 1280 by 720. You can quickly get that set up. And then if we look in any of these viewports, if we press Option V, that gives us our viewport options. And what that's useful for is if we click the header bar of any of those and these little dots, that's how we can import an image as the background. So if I look at my old bike photo from a different tutorial, I can get that as a reference, and that really helps if we're doing stuff with modeling that we would want different viewports to have different images. And one other shortcut I really like for the viewport, if I just make 2 spheres real quick with my little flyout menu, sphere, copy, paste, move it over, is there's this display options for shading with lines, wireframe, and there's a shortcut to access that, which is the N key, and then I can different letters to get those. So rather than going all the way up here, if I just wanted to change this to shading with lines, I could do N, B, wireframes, N, G, and then if I want to go back to my preferred method with shading in lines, NB again, and that will save us some time. And just to do my due diligence and make sure I'm covering everything I can think of, we have our default move, scale, rotation shortcuts. So E to move, R to rotate, T to scale, and then over here we have our selection. So if we were getting into modeling, we can use 8, 9, and 0 for a different type of selection. So I like using this mode to grab some points. So 0 is the one that I usually use. For changing which axis we're moving on, we can just use the keys X, Y, and Z in case you want to lock those and unlock to one axis, and then W up here for object or world. And this is useful if you move something and you rotate it and you got to line it up and you want to keep it on this angle sometimes, or once in a while you may need to rotate exactly up and you want to get that default option back. You can just press W and get those back. And seeing this arrow reminds me of one other little great tip that I really like. If we're moving stuff, or say we're over here and we're drawing a spline, this little arrow thing can actually get in the way sometimes when you're trying to put a point, say right here. If you press Option D, it hides and unhides that, so you can get really close and still use those tools, and just Option D to get it back when you're done. And if we're done drawing a spline, we would want to remember to go back to model mode. So we could go over here, or again, we could just press V, go to Tools, Model, get that back. And the other one that's there is this Enable Axis, which is the same as L over here. So you could use this icon and use V to get the same thing. And there's also this little menu that I have in my layout for Axis Center. If you go to Mesh, Axis Center. What this allows us to do is sometimes when you're dropping objects into other objects, say we had a couple end sides, and I'll just hold Command to duplicate that, and maybe I put it into a loft. Sometimes that axis isn't where we would want it to be. So we press L, we can move that. Maybe we would just want the pivot point to be up here, and then if we press L again, it could rotate around here. And sometimes what happens with these is once in a while the axis will end up way over here. So we can do with this little menu is if we just include all children objects and then execute, it 99% of the time for me drops that axis exactly where I want it to be. So I do find myself using the L key on and off to move the axis, as well as this axis center menu, just to make sure in case it's not letting me do what I want, I can always use this and it's gonna snap that back to the center. So I'll delete that loft and delete that spline and the sphere and just go back to when I have one, and then I'll go back here and copy and paste that, move it over with E, and let's talk a little bit about textures and tags and some shortcuts for applying textures and changing textures. So down here in our little texture editor, the quickest way to create new textures is just double click and then double click on it, and we can name this one, I'll make a green texture, and just kind of get a basic texture of a color with some reflection and Fresnel, and just change the spec a little just to make it not the default settings. So when I close this out, to apply it to this shape, I can drag it here or drag it over here. I'll just drag it here. And what's nice about all these menus is if you hold Command, you can drag right or up and down when we're over here and duplicate our object. So I have this and I want a blue texture with all the same properties but not the same color. Rather than making a new texture, I can just hold Command, drag this over, double click it, name it blue, go to color, change it to blue, and then drag it to here. And if I drop in a light and just do a quick render with Command R, we can see that it's getting the same properties and reflection, and all we had to do was change the color property. And now that we have objects and we're starting to render, let's just quickly point out the different ways to render. There's Shift R to render to our picture viewer, which I had over on the other monitor, and Option R to get our area render, so we can render out a little part of it and change the quality over here with this little arrow. So we talked about how to quickly create and duplicate textures with the same properties. Let's talk about how to do that same thing with the tags over here. And that's the way that the material is being projected onto the image, which might not always be the same and has a lot of these different settings based on what you're trying to do. So if we had this texture and we want to make the green sphere blue, we could hold Command and drop it here and it will add it, or we can not hold Command and it will move it. Or if we wanted to replace this green, we could drag it over here and then get this down arrow and it's going to replace it. And what's useful is if we had no texture on this one, say I'll just delete this, and we wanted to duplicate this tag, we could drag this and hold Command and duplicate it. And for just colors, it doesn't seem like a really big deal, but what's useful for this is, say we had each of these with a logo on it and we've lined up the logo and we don't want to do it twice, we just want to swap out the logo. So to illustrate that, I'll just copy paste both of these spheres, move these forward, and what I have over here in Photoshop is just a quick little transparent image of logo A and logo B. So I'll save this one out, File, Save for Web, to get transparency as a transparent PNG, and save this one as logo B. So now back in Cinema 4D, if I want to drop those onto these front spheres, I can, again, just duplicate this texture, because then I can grab the reflection and the spec and double click this and just call this logo A. And for color, just use an image, so I'll grab logo A. And then for the alpha, turn that on and grab that same image, and that's going to knock out the transparency of it, so no. And then if I drag this onto any of these spheres, it's going to add it as a second texture, and you can see it doesn't line up how I would have it in my mind by default. So what I have to do is change the tag properties, and I can change it to spherical if I want, and take off tiling, get it down, I'll just type in numbers, to the location and size that I want. So it's still too big, kind of scale it down and offset it with UV offsets, and then just move it down. And the point being that to get it lined up exactly where I want it on this sphere, it took a little bit of work to do that. And that's not in the texture, that's in the tag. So rather than doing that whole same process, if I wanted another logo on this other sphere, I can duplicate the tag after I have that second texture. So I'll just quickly make that same second texture but with a different logo. Command, drag, change this to logo B, change the alpha to logo B, don't copy, as well as the color. And again, there I have a quick texture, but I don't want to just drag this on as a second texture because then it's not going to put it the same place I want. So what I can do is hold Command and duplicate that tag, and then down here under Material, click this little pointer and direct it to this material, and then I've copied and pasted the tag and just swapped out the texture, and that saved a ton of time. So now if I wanted these to be color and maybe these to be a gray, I can just duplicate this, change this to a gray, and then use that little trick we talked about of dragging this as a down arrow onto this, delete that one, Command to drag this down. And you can see we're able to swap stuff out and move things around really quickly. And this copying and pasting and editing tags is really useful for textures and lots of other things when you're adding other tags such as dynamics. So if I just set up a quick dynamic scene, I'll have a floor and move it down, and I'll add collider body to this floor, and then to just one of these spheres I'll add a rigid body and just change the settings a bit. So I'll say like 75 bounce and 25 friction, and then play this on our timeline. This is the first time we talk about timelines. And now that we're talking about time and frames, it'd be a good point to talk about the shortcuts for this, because I have to back this up to redo the dynamic simulation. So I could drag this to the back or press this, or I can press Shift F to go to the beginning of this, or Shift G to go to the end, and then F and G to play one frame at a time forward and backwards. So it's super helpful to just press Shift F when you're doing dynamic simulation. And then there's also even shortcut F8 for play if you're into using the function keys for shortcuts. So I'll just Shift F and then move this up, play, and that's not too interesting. So on the tag for dynamics, maybe I'll change this bounce to 100, friction to like 5, play, and on the floor I'm going to change that to 100 bounce and 0 friction, and again just back up and play, and now I'm getting a little bounce, and maybe that's what I wanted, and maybe I'll just tilt the floor a little to make it a little interesting. Alright, so then we're getting some dynamics. So again, we put a bit of work into this dynamics of this sphere, changing it from the default. So if I wanted all of these spheres to have those properties, I can just quickly hold Command, drag it here, drag it here, drag it here, and then if I back up the timeline, move all these up, and play, now I'm getting that same dynamics on all of those, which is, again, a huge time saver. And what's nice is even if I've applied all of these, over here I can click and hold and drag, and I can edit the values of all of them at the same time. So if I wanted to change the bounciness of all of these objects, I could turn off the bounce and turn up the friction to just get them to lock to the floor, and then play, and they're all going to have that same property. And I can even just do a couple of them. Maybe I want just these two to lock, but these logos to be really bouncy and interesting. I can grab both of those tags, turn that bounce way up, friction way down, and again, just keep using, the shortcuts we're going over to speed up our workflow. So let's talk about a couple modeling shortcuts when you're getting into more complex polygonal modeling, and then we'll talk about a couple timeline pointers, and that'll wrap up my list of favorite shortcuts. So I'm just going to move the camera over here and grab myself a cube and move it as well, move it up a bit, and I'll get it exactly at 100 just because I can keep track of it. And then on the cube, I'm going to add a couple segments. And beyond just adding fillets and beveling this whole thing, once you get into more complex polygonal modeling and you're using this button or pressing C to make something editable, there's a bunch of extra shortcuts that really speed up this process as well. So that's why I do like the little flyout menu with V, because that's how we can grab these little polygons and move them, as well as edges and shift clicking to grab multiple edges, or points And once you're modeling like this, there's a lot of extra tools up here in Mesh, Create, Transform, as well as Sculpt that you can use to add geometry and move the geometry around. And again, I don't like using the time to go to all these menus, so that's why it's really helpful to use some of these shortcuts that Cinema 4D has for this stuff. Say I want to extrude this polygon in the middle, I can grab that polygon with this tool, and rather than going to the command up here for extrude, I can press D for extrude, and then just up and down or left and right mouse to extrude it, or I for inner extrude. So say if I want to inner extrude this and then extrude the center part, I can press D again, pull this out, and save a lot of time using those few, as well as a couple additional menus that I really like for modeling, which you get by pressing either M for modeling shortcuts or U for selection shortcuts, and those give you extra keys that you can press to add things like extra geometry or select it and speed that up. So say that now I have this shape, I want to select both of these rings of lines and then bevel them. I can quickly hold V to get my edges and then press L for edge loop selection, and then grab this loop and then grab this loop. And now I selected those a lot quicker than selecting the edges separately. And then if I want to bevel them, I can press M, and you have to press these keys. It's not a mouse menu. And then I can press S for bevel and drag this out and get the same bevel on both. All of these are really helpful. One that I always find myself using is knife. So if I just grab an edge and press M, K, what I can use this for is adding an extra edge loop in. So if I change the mode to loop and restrict to selection, you can see that it gives me this loop that's based on the geometry, so I can add geometry here and here if I need extra, and then press E to get back to arrow. And if I want to grab that loop, just do edges and then UL again, and now I can move that around, scale it, and just a really quick little shortcut to add extra geometry. The last little tip that I use a lot is when we're in different views and we're on our rectangle selection with the 0 key, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes we want to grab all the points that are right here that are on multiple sides that we can and cannot see. So if I just grab those, it just grabs 2 that it can see because only select visible is selected. If I uncheck this and then grab those, it's going to grab all of those, which 99% of the time is what I want, because I would want to be able to drag all of those points out. So if you have something where there's extra little points, you need to collapse them, it's useful in my opinion to turn this only select visible elements off, and then you can use the different views and know that you're going to be grabbing all of the points. So I'll just undo that, get into this view. We made this kind of weird shape. I'll just go back to model mode, kind of zoom out a bit and see what was going on. We've talked about some shortcuts with the timeline, but we haven't talked about the actual timeline in window timeline, and we haven't added any keyframes because all of our animation is based on dynamics that we have here. So let's just quickly point out a couple shortcuts with the timeline. So say that I wanted to have this little box thing that I made rotate around based on keyframe animation. So if I back up to the beginning, grab my cube shape, go to coordinates and command click to add a keyframe to just this parameter, and then say go ahead 30 frames, change this value, or rotate live here. Then again, command click to add a keyframe. Now you can see we have 2 keyframes down here, and if we go to the timeline window timeline, we have 2 frames here. So the different ways to use these effectively is on our mini timeline here, I can click and drag to select keyframes and then click and drag to move them or undo that. I can use my same right click, cut, copy, paste menu, but I can also just do Command C, Command V, or delete to delete those. So if I just wanted to quickly get rid of this one rather than edit, delete, or right clicking delete, I can just select it, press delete or Command C, and then go ahead in time, press Command V, and speed up workflow on this little timeline as well. Now with our full timeline, again window timeline, maybe we have a bunch of keyframes and there's a lot that's going on here. There's a couple of shortcuts that are really nice to moving around in this view. Is if we press 1 and hold, that's going to allow us to drag and pan around. If we press 2 and drag left and right, that's going to zoom in and out. And if we marquee select multiple keyframes, we can see we have the keyframe options like easing, and there's shortcuts for these too if you look at the bottom left of the screen by using Alt or Option E, I, or O. So if I wanted all of these to just be easy easing or easy easing, I could just select them and then press Option E and know that those will be effective. So those are kind of my workflow shortcut tips. I hope this was helpful. If you have any shortcuts that you like to use, let me know and post it in the comments. And I hope that everyone got a lot out of my little workflow. Always use shortcuts, press every button on the keyboard, and work quicker tips. This was Sean Frangella, and I will see you at the next video. Thanks for watching.